Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and my channel members. Today, as guests, I have Eric Hernandez. Hello, Eric.
Hey, how's it going?
And Bill Kluck.
Hey,
Bill, you might remember from last week from the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Bill, remind us again a little bit about the book club.
well, we do a Christian book, which we're going to do a lazy approach to evangelism by Eric Hernandez. So he was nice enough to give me a book and be on the show. It's going to be first Thursday in June at 7 p.m. So please come and excellent book. I really enjoyed it and had some great arguments, some things I might disagree with. So yeah, we'll see.
Okay, very good. And there is a link in the description both to the Atheist and Christian Book Club, and there is a link to the Amazon copy of Eric's book. And Eric, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your book.
Name's Eric Hernandez. I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses everything from speaking at churches, doing seminars and apologetics conferences, and being on fine shows like this. Regarding the book, it's a lazy approach to evangelism, a simple guide for conversing with non-believers. And the main thrust of the book is, one, to kind of make an apologetic for apologetics. I find today many Christians, even pastors and churches, tend to shun it or have a misconception of it or think it's just arguing with people. And so it's like I said, the main thrust being how to even have conversations, start these conversations, be respectful, be productive as opposed to wasting time arguing over something you shouldn't be arguing about or things of that nature. And then providing a case for Christianity as far as first God's existence and then Christianity being the resurrection.
Okay, very good, very good. And we are providing you with an audience of unbelievers so that you can practice what you preach.
Fantastic.
By the way, Eric, would you say your approach is, you have presuppositionalism, evidentialism, and a cumulative case? How would you classify your apologetic?
I would consider it a classical apologetic, definitely not a presup. In fact, I had a discussion/debate with Seitim Bruggencate, a well-known presupper, so we disagreed methodologically. So yeah, you could call it that two-step approach. Yeah.
Okay, now Eric, I let Eric pick the topic for today's show, and Eric picked, are there any good reasons to believe in God? And obviously my answer would be quick and simple, and that would be no. So Eric, what are your reasons for believing that there is a God?
Yeah. So to not to push back on your answer or anything, even start pushing back just yet, but I would say just first, people could say there are good reasons and yet still think they're not good enough reasons, so to speak.
Okay.
So that there could be reasons and evidence for something doesn't make something true. So that being said, I'd like to start in just kind of what started to convince me, or however you want to hash that out, because I grew up in church, but of course I had questions and whatnot, and put it all on the line, so to speak. There's an argument from Alvin Plantinga. C.S. Lewis has a version of this. Plantinga calls his the evolutionary argument against naturalism, and this was one of those kind of aha moments that really made me pause and think and seeing the bigger picture of all this. So I'll put it this way, and feel free to jump in at any point. So first, I'd say if we're going to say either God does exist or does not exist, right, that seems to be exhaustive. So we can say it is either true that the statement God does not exist is true, or the statement that God does exist is true. So we could classify the first one as, go ahead.
I would say that you could also have the statement, I don't know whether God exists or not.
Right, but that wouldn't be an answer to whether or not God does exist. In other words, the question of God's
existence. It would not
existence.
be an answer to whether or not God exists, but it would answer the question of, do I have enough information to know whether or not God exists?
Right, and so that's more of an epistemic question where I'm talking ontological. So, in other words, is there gold on Mars? Yes or no? Well, the answer is yes or no, right? There, it's either there is or there isn't. So there either is a God or is not a God. And I would say that if we could define atheism as the belief God does not exist, either that's true or theism is true, the belief God does exist. So given that these are mutually exclusive, if you can show that one is not true, then by default the other one is true. So with this in mind, I would say to even answer the question of whether or not God exists, we would have to have a few assumptions. Namely, we would have to be able to be rational, and we would have to be able to be justified in our beliefs, to have knowledge. At minimum, I would say knowledge is what would be called a justified true belief. You need to believe it, it needs to be true, it needs to have a justification. If you're missing one of those ingredients, you can't have knowledge. So I would say if there is no God, you can't even answer the question because you wouldn't be able to be rationally justified, and thus you wouldn't be able to have knowledge. And here's why I say that. To summarize Flanagan's argument, or give my version of it, starting with a go ahead.
You're cutting out just a bit, so I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding you, but I'm getting enough of it that I'm catching what you're saying.
Okay, let me know if that keeps happening. So I don't know why.
Are you familiar with the evolutionary argument against naturalism, Kelly?
I'm familiar with enough of what was in Eric's book. I read what was
It's
in
actually a
Eric's
pretty good
book.
argument. What it's saying that we're evolved to survive, and so we're not necessarily evolved to be rational, objective creatures. And if evolution is a random event, then how in the world can we trust our reason when it's not, evolved to be totally objective and, reasonable and so forth? So it's an interesting argument. It's by the great Alvin Plantinga, the great presuppositionalist.
Well,
Am I right
Plantinga
there?
wasn't a presupposition. Close. Plantinga wasn't a presuppositionalist, though. But so here's how I'd lay out the argument. Starting with the definition of knowledge, justified true belief. Starting with a thought experiment. Suppose I wake up from a nap and I look at the microwave to see what time it is, and it says 12 o'clock. And on that basis of the microwave's reading, I form the belief it's 12 o'clock. But then I notice that it's really hot in the house. I notice there's water under the fridge. And then I look back and see the microwave is actually blinking 12 o'clock. So the question is it 12 o'clock? Well, the answer would have to be, I don't know, because it could be 12 o'clock. Broken clocks still right twice a day. But what this shows is that I now have an undercutting defeater, is what we call in epistemology, that would remove any justification for my belief given the reading of the microwave. So any belief that is now based on the reading of the microwave now has an undercutting defeater for it. Okay, with this in mind, if there is no God, and atheism is true, and the only way to explain our existence would be Darwinian evolution via natural selection. Now,
I disagree with you there completely.
Okay, go ahead.
Just because we don't know what the explanation is for us existing doesn't mean that our existence is due to a God or that it is due to natural selection. Before we understood natural selection, we certainly existed. And if we came about by some other means other than natural selection, we would still continue to exist. So I don't think that evolution by natural selection is the only explanation for our existence. What's more, evolution is a biology, not it has nothing to do with cosmology. And evolution did not begin until biology began, which was not until I don't know. Science is not my field, and so I don't know the exact number of years, but the universe is 13 billion years old, but the Earth is only
4.5 billion.
4.5 billion years old. So there were definitely billions of years during which the universe existed,
Kelly,
but there was no evolution.
The first prokaryotic cell was 3.5 billion years ago. And it takes 1 billion years to get a nucleus, to get a eukaryotic cell. So the question is what took God so long to go from prokaryotic to eukaryotic? Do you got any answers, Eric?
No, I'm not even really familiar with that. But I would say everything, though, thus far hasn't been relevant to the argument. And so let me reiterate why, or let me perhaps clarify why. So this is an epistemic argument, not a cosmological argument. And I think what you're arguing, Kelly, is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you said even if we didn't know how we got here, we still existed. But I'm not arguing epistemically. I mean, I'm not arguing that because we don't know, therefore something like God. So far, I'm just saying, given the best evidence we have, if there were no God, based on the evidence we have today, the best explanation would be Darwinian evolution via natural selection.
That might be the best explanation for the existence of humans, but that's not the best explanation for the existence of the universe.
Yes,
the
but
universe can exist without humans.
Right. Yeah, and I'm not arguing on cosmology.
Okay.
All right. So, and thank you for jumping in. I want to be clear, from the outset. That way, We don't talk past each other. So if that's the case, then everything that we have being a byproduct of natural selection, that would include not just hands, teeth, nails. That would even include our, what Planet Go would call our cognitive faculties. So let's just say our brain. So I think we'd all agree that if there's no God, our brains would not be designed to obtain truth. Yes?
Well, I don't think our brains were designed. So, yeah, okay. I would agree with you that I do think that that is the case, but I don't know. I have not explored that idea far enough to know whether or not there are any other possibilities.
But as far as just as that statement stands, given there's no designer, our brains wouldn't be designed for anything, right?
Correct.
Including, okay. So our brains aren't designed to obtain truth. Now, with this in mind, on top of that, so if you have natural selection driving this, which again would be the best explanation that I would say, given the evidence we have, there's no God, then you now have that your cognitive faculties are also a byproduct of natural selection. And on top of that, natural selection, to personify here, could care less whether or not your beliefs are true. Natural selection is going to, at best, aim for survival value, not truth value. So,
well, okay, and I realize you gave the caveat that natural selection has personality and it doesn't drive for anything in particular, but because what is not the goal of natural selection, but what is the result of natural selection is survival.
Right.
What comes about can be different in different environments, and a good example is the fox. A fox that is red, it will naturally survive better in the forest, but a red fox will not survive in the tundra. And so the very same trait that is selected for in one environment is selected against in another. And so to say that natural selection is driving for any particular trait is incorrect, because it's always what it's doing is it's bringing about survival and flourishing, but not necessarily any particular trait that brings that about.
Right, which is exactly what my argument would say as well. Like that actually would only play into what I'm arguing. So yes, yes, and amen. So it's only aiming for survival value, typically via adaptive behavior, just as you well articulated. Right. So again, though, the point being here is simply that it's not aiming for truth value. Its aim, if we can call it that, would be survival value, whatever causes the organism to adapt to survive. Now, all that being said, now you get to the fact that you can have false beliefs producing adaptive behavior and survival value. So my beliefs don't have to be true. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. So if false beliefs can produce survival value and the brain is a byproduct of this natural selection, then what happens is, just like the microwave illustration, just as we have an undercutting defeater for any belief based on the reading of the microwave, then if there's no God, we now have an undercutting defeater for any belief our brain produces, including the belief there's no God. So if there is no God and your brain tells you that there is no God, and given this undercutting defeater, you now have a belief that you shouldn't trust. And thus, to even answer these questions, and then you wouldn't have knowledge, because you would have all justification removed. To even have knowledge, atheism couldn't be true. And thus, if we do have knowledge, then atheism is false, and thus theism is true.
Yes, but it also works the other way around as well. Because natural selection does not cause us to necessarily believe what is true, but what brings about best survival. If belief in God is valuable to our survival, we might believe in God even if there is no God.
Yes, but note how that only affirms my argument, though. It's not an objection to it.
No, I wasn't objecting to your argument. I'm just saying that the argument works both ways.
Yes.
In fact, I fully believe that is why the belief in God developed, is because at one time it was a survival benefit. And I think that is why we are moving away from religion, because it is losing it.
So going back to the argument then, if you've agreed so far, then you now have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces.
That it's possible that the only reason, not necessarily, because just because it's possible that I can believe something because it is of survival value to me, doesn't mean that that is the reason that I believe it. I'm also going to examine the reasons that I believe something. And yes, it's possible that I could come to a conclusion because of a false survival value. I think our own ability to research the reasoning behind it is counter to that.
And what organ would you be using to do this?
Well, my brain, obviously.
Right. And the argument I gave just gave an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. So you would essentially be arguing
No,
that
because
you
I
can
don't think it is an undercutting of anything your brain produces. I think it's an undercutting for certain things that your brain can produce.
So with the microwave illustration, if I can go back that, and if I were to run to my bedroom and look at the alarm clock and say, well, the alarm clock says 12 o'clock as well, therefore I'm justified. The problem still remains that the power affects everything plugged into the wall. So I think what you're doing is you're appealing to other beliefs, but again, it's a belief your brain produces. And the undercutting aspect would be that it's not designed for truth, and it is aimed at best for survival value, not truth value. So you now have a reason to not trust. And I'm not saying even your beliefs are false. I'm not saying you can't have true beliefs. I'm saying that removes any justification for any belief your brain produces. And if knowledge is a justified true belief, you now cannot even have knowledge if there is no God.
Well, I think if your argument is true, you also can't have any knowledge even if there is a God.
Well, but no, if there is a God, then it's not the brain is not designed to obtain truth, and we don't have a mechanism that is aiming
we don't
purely
know
for
that.
survival, not truth.
We don't know that.
We don't know what.
We don't know that there is a God that gave us a reason to believe in truth.
But I think you're missing the point of the argument here. And I'm in other words, I'm going to set that aside. Just feel free to bring it up later. If the argument is successful, then what it shows is that if there is no God, we cannot be rationally justified because we have an undercutting defeater for any belief our brain produces, and by that we cannot have knowledge. So to argue against, in other words, it's an attack against atheism, because if atheism is false, theism is true. So even if you said, well, theism is false, that only again adds credibility to my argument, because my argument assumes theism is false and then says here's a conclusion. So it's a sort of reductio ad absurdum argument.
Okay. Can we call this a draw? Oh, by the way, Eric, one of the best arguments, which we were talking about earlier, the fine-tuning argument, which says that there is certain constants in nature, like the cosmological constant, 10 to the 120th, the gravitational constant, precise to 10 to the 60th, the Planck's constant, and of course, one of the really fun ones is the fine structure constant, 1 over 137. In physics, the great Richard Feynman said that every physicist should put this on their wall and worry about it. If this number isn't just right, if it's too large, you'll get the electrons too close to the nucleus and you won't get chemical reactions. If it's too low, if it's like 4% less, you have problems too. So you don't, if this number's not just, if it's too far off, you're not going to get nuclear synthesis and stars producing carbon. So it is, these things have to be fairly precise. And some of the people like Sean Carroll have even admitted that these constants and parameters in nature are troublesome to an atheistic worldview.
I think Nerdy Rodent asks a good question. How does let's see, I guess the question would then be, how does God know what is true? Because if no one designed God's brain, God doesn't even have a brain, how does God know what is true?
So this is a common pushback, and I find it telling. I don't mind it, but I find it telling. Note how, one, it's not an objection. Let's pretend I say I don't know. It doesn't affect the argument, right? It's like saying I'm focusing on this argument and say, okay, but what color is the grass? You know, it's one of those things where even if I said I don't know, it doesn't affect the argument, and the argument stands and has, you know, if I can say it this way, I'm not taking any jabs, so please don't hear me saying that. But if there's no objection to the argument and nothing's successful, no defeater for the argument, for its defeater, when the argument stands as is, even if I couldn't answer another question. So if there is no God, again, we cannot have knowledge, can't be rationally justified, undercutting defeater. Now, when it comes to God, which we're now leaving the argument, so if we're okay with setting the argument aside and letting it stand, but I don't know if you want to do that.
No, I don't want to do that. Okay. We can come back to it, or if you want to answer this, or we can go back to it now, whichever you prefer.
Well, I would say God is omniscient necessarily.
Okay. Um, all right. If there is no God, now your argument is that therefore I can't know if anything is true or false.
I would say if there's no God, then the main two problems that you cannot be rationally justified because you have an undercutting defeater for any belief your brain produces. And then without that ingredient, you now can no longer have knowledge.
Wouldn't I need knowledge isn't knowledge of true things a survival benefit though?
It could be, but
Yeah.
now we're talking. It could be, but here's the problem: is we're talking about epistemology and being justified in our beliefs. So you can accidentally have a true belief, but then how would you know it? Well, then now you go back to the question of justified true belief. But again, going with this undercutting defeater, you're now not able to be justified because you have this undercutting defeater that you need to override in order to come back to being justified.
But let's take the Big Bang, Eric, okay, which Christians love to use as evidence of God. The universe is expanding, and again, if this constant, the cosmological constant, isn't just right, if the dark energy is just not right, then the galaxies just fly apart. They don't, form. If uh, if it's not expanding too slow, then it goes into a black hole, into a crunch. So what they say, if you wind this back, because it's expanding, if you wind the universe back, you come to this singularity, and it implies something outside of space, time, and matter actually started this Big Bang off. So we can look at evidence, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was God. It could be, as Roger Penrose said, it could be a cyclical conformity where universes are expanding into each other and so forth. So
Yeah.
we can know some truth by observation, right, in science?
But and what organ would you use to know
Well,
these
your brain,
things?
yeah, which is very faulty. We have all sorts of cognitive biases, confirmation
But note
bias.
it's not just that it's faulty. It's that you're undercut in any belief it produces. So if what you're saying is we can have knowledge, then again
But we
that
don't
only
say that. You keep claiming that, but I don't make that claim. I think we can have knowledge.
well I make it an argument, not just a claim. I make it an argument if there's no God you can't have knowledge because any justification is undercut.
I realize that that's your argument, but I'm not buying it.
But why
But
not?
Eric, even if you grant there's a God, look at the evidence. You have the Permian extinction 250 million years ago, the one that killed the dinosaurs, the KT, 65 million years ago. Why would God create all these organisms and stuff just to go and extinguish 95% of them?
So sticking to the argument, let's pretend I say I don't know. We're still back to the problem of being undercut here.
But it does
In other words,
imply that there is not a God, right? Doesn't it seem more likely that it's just this random universe, that you have asteroids that hit the Yucatan Peninsula and just randomly
so
knock out 95% of all life?
one of the things I love about this argument that I'm using is that to even answer any question, including whether or not there's a God, we have to first be able to be rationally justified and have knowledge. And I'm saying when we start there, and if you can't even get that if there's no God,
But
then
what
any
I'm
question.
saying, I'm not rationally justified, but I'm just saying existentially, doesn't it seem to imply that this is just random, this universe that we live
Uh,
in, this world we live in?
but no, to answer your question, I would have to assume some sort of knowledge about anything,
Okay,
and then
so
to
it's
have
meaningless. Okay.
no, not even meaningless. I'm saying what I find telling is most, and I'm not talking about you guys. I'm just saying in general. Yes, this is the common response to an argument like this is to ask, well, what about A, B, and C? And I'm thinking, well, I still want to stay here first because it's almost like, and I don't want to accuse anybody of dodging here. I guess I accuse Bill. Bill and I are friends, so I could say that about him. It almost seems to be a dodging question
But
to
how about
avoid
if I just
this.
give up and just say, okay, you're right. I'm just gonna, with my flawed, uh, personality due to a noetic effects of sin, where my whole will, emotions, everything is just uh, sinful and bad and not to be trusted. But I'm just making some uh, com- uh, uh, comparisons. Do you see what I'm saying? Some recognition.
Yes, but if you concede the argument and give up, then you're conceding that you can't trust a belief your brain produces, and thus
I
you're now
don't
stuck
trust my
in.
brain because of confirmation bias, all these biases. I don't trust my memory. Yeah, absolutely true.
So then how are you rationally justified in anything?
I'm just making observations. That's the word I was looking for. That it
But
doesn't. And here's another observation. There's like 200 billion or trillion, you never know what, galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars. What's with the overkill? I mean, scientists have said there's as many suns as there are grains of sand in the beaches of the world. It's just, why so much? Not that I have an answer. I mean, do you have an observation or a clue, let's say, of why that's so?
so before I do answer that, let me just first say, though, that even if you're saying I'm just making observations, are you rationally justified in the observations you're making?
No,
Okay, so why should I
I'm just
believe?
making an observation. Yeah.
But you believe that you're rationally justified in the observation, right?
Not
You
really.
believe there's
It could
reason to
be.
believe it.
I have a flawed brain, and I'm just making an observation, and I would just like to know what you think of the overkill of all these galaxies and stuff. And,
So
and
are we moving past the argument? Is I guess what I'm asking.
yes, please.
Okay.
How about you win?
I don't concede that Eric has won. I definitely do not.
And I'm not claiming to win. I just
Yeah.
I just see this as a discussion here. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I need to give it some more thought because
fair enough.
philosophy is not my field either. As we were discussing this before the show, that I did take Philosophy 101 in 1980 before Eric was even born, and I don't remember a whole lot of it. That was a long time ago. So I would have to give that some more thought, but as one of the viewers commented, and I put the comment on the screen for a minute, this isn't a reason to believe in God. This is really just a reason that if I don't have knowledge, there probably is a God, and that this God is okay. So you're saying that there's a positive reason to believe in a God as a result. Okay, go ahead. Why do you think that there is a positive reason to believe in a God?
So a few things here. As I explained, and maybe this person came in late. I'm not sure, but anyone familiar with the way logic works in the sense of especially when you have a disjunctive syllogism. This gets a little more technical, but essentially, if you have two options on the table, there either is a God or is not a God. Either A or, let's say, A or not A. If not A is false, then it's not A, therefore A is true. So yes, if I can show one of these options is not true, then that is a positive reason to believe the other option.
Okay. But yeah. All right.
So anyway,
So you
Eric,
believe that there is reason to think that there is a God.
That argument was one of them, yeah.
Yeah. And I have taken the position that I am agnostic to most gods because there are thousands of gods out there, most of which I could not name and have never heard of. And so I take no position as to whether or not those gods exist because I don't know anything about those gods. I take the positive atheist approach as to the Christian God because I can say truthfully that the Christian God does not exist because he is logically impossible.
So Eric, if God's or man is God's ultimate goal here, right? Why did it take 99% of time, millions of years, billion, to get to, we've only been in existence for, 6 million years at best. Why did it take God so long? If man is the crowning achievement of God's creation, why did it take so long?
So I don't know if I'd say man is a crowning achievement of God. I know Craig gave a great answer when he debated Hitchens on this and talked about the fullness of time and whatnot. And I think everybody before Christ was only less than 2%, and it's even less than that of people that have ever existed.
Mm-hmm.
So I could say I wouldn't be able to give the articulate answer, but I'd say if there is a God and is omniscient, then he would know when and where and how. And yeah, I have no complaints. And why so long? So to even implicitly answer the question you asked earlier, when I asked if we're wanting to move on, the overkill you said. Well, it's important to note that throughout the history of Christianity, God has been seen as an artist prior to being seen as an engineer. So the overkill or the why so much only applies to someone with limited resources. The alleged that you seem to be implying that this is taking so long, again, only seems to apply to people that is limited on time. So if God himself likes to look at it, that's a reason. If B, God just loves to decorate, that's a reason. So we can have aesthetic reasons, and to assume it must be some type of efficient or engineering type of a reason is really more of a modern notion, which I agree with, but this isn't the history of what everybody has thought of when it comes to what we would call creation.
But you have something like dinosaurs that come into the scene 220 million years ago in the Triassic and then die out 65 million years. I mean, this is millions of years, almost 200 million years. And then God just extincts them. I mean, what is the purpose? Do you see how it just seems kind of chaotic and random, that it doesn't seem to have a plan here?
So no, a preliminary remark I'd say is note. I don't know of any apologist that would argue that the existence of dinosaurs as an argument for God's existence. So again, I go back to and this is part of what I call a lazy approach. I am admittedly showing my cards here. Note how, even if I didn't answer that, the argument I presented thus far, and I have a few more if you want to go through them for God's existence, why I believe in God, love to hear your thoughts. Nevertheless, even if I said I don't know to any of these things, it wouldn't affect the arguments I'm providing. So at this point, given that you're, as you said, Kelly, practice what I preach, so to speak. Well, then what I preach, to use that word loosely, would be if someone doesn't believe in God, I start with, okay, let's first talk about whether or not we have reasons to believe there is a God. And that's my starting point. All these other questions great questions, fair questions. There have been great answers put forth towards it. But whether or not I can explain why it took so long or however you'd like to phrase it, the question still remains, is there a God? Now we can go to other things of like, okay, do we think he was efficient in this? Do we think it was worth doing this? But then we get to the point where we're just trying to psychoanalyze God, which is also not an argument for God's existence. Right. Yeah. So I know of no apologist that uses a psychoanalysis argument of God in order to explain therefore God exists.
But let me give an example. One of the great cards is the Cambrian explosion, where you have the major phyla like the echinoderms, chordates like us, and so forth, suddenly appear in the fossil record with a little bit of precursors in the Ediacaran, okay, before that. But you also have these endogenous retroviruses. And for you guys that don't know, this totally impacts the credibility of the Genesis narrative, because us and chimps on our genomes millions of years ago seems to come from a common ancestor. We have the same markers on our genome. So what my question to you is, can you live with the tension that we have evidence for creation, the Cambrian explosion, but the endogenous retroviruses, which seem to indicate a common ancestor between us, chimpanzees, gorillas, etc., that is just a killer for creationism and the Genesis narrative. Can you live with that tension?
Well, I'd first say I don't think it's a killer. To answer the question simply, sure, I can live with the tension. And on top of that, I would say that if Christianity is true, then, if we're doing an internal critique, if you will, then yes, we would expect death, disease, suffering, famine to happen if God exists and Christianity is true. So to point to something that verifies what Christianity predicts, I don't see how it could be in principle used as an argument against it, as if to fault something for being consistent with what it predicts.
Well, another thing, you have, let me just finish up here. You have death and disease before the fall. You have cancer and dinosaurs. You have thorns millions of years ago before the fall. So doesn't that impact the atonement? Because why did Christ die if the death and disease is the normal order of things?
So now we're getting into theology, which I don't mind, but we're now... So if anything, what it would impact, and I'm not even trying to give an answer here. I'm more of a philosopher than a scientist. But philosophically speaking, at best, what we're doing here is we'd have to say perhaps our interpretation of some of these verses you're alluding to are wrong. So if it's talking about human death is the main thing, or without going to all the, Joshua Swamidass wrote a great book. I haven't read all of it, but I've heard him talk on it and excerpts from it. But essentially, this is why I say we're going to theology, because now we're arguing theological positions. But to not waste time on that, and I don't mean theology is a waste of time, before someone tries to, not you guys, but some Christian who doesn't like me, try to take that out of context. Let's say that there are theological positions consistent with and protects even predicting everything you're saying. So at best, that would only affect a certain view of a certain doctrine within Christianity. At best.
Okay.
Eric, what is your position on creation? Do you believe that do you believe in evolution?
No.
Okay. So you think do you think the earth is over 6,000 years old?
No idea.
You think the earth is less than 6,000 years old, or approximately 6,000 years old?
So as you alluded to earlier with the notion of agnosticism, I would say I'm agnostic, and primarily because I don't care how the earth is. It's not an issue for me. In fact,
Hey,
even
Kelly,
though
I
It
asked Josh.
should be, because
I asked
we can-
Josh McDowell that question. I said, Josh, is it old or are you old Earth or young Earth? You know what he said? I'm 62. I mean, are you like Jesus?
because here, one of the major problems with the young earth position is is radioactive decay. And we can tell how much radioactive decay has occurred since the beginning of the earth. And if all of the radioactive decay that has occurred, and we also know the rate of radioactive decay, and it is not possible that all of the radioactive decay could have occurred at the current rate and the earth only be 6,000 years old. Now, I realize that the young earth creationists say that the radioactive decay rate was much faster, particularly before the time of the flood. But if you do that, you vaporize the earth, because there's heat produced when the radioactive decay occurs.
And that's fine with me, because like I said, I don't care how the earth is. I don't think it's relevant to whether or not God exists. Nor do I think Genesis is trying to touch on that. So even in the book, I
it's
say,
not. It has nothing to do with whether or not God exists. It has to. The earth
But isn't
exists.
that the
You will
topic of the show?
acknowledge that the earth exists, correct?
Of course.
So if the earth exists and the radioactive decay that we can measure and we know the rate of tells us that the earth is over 6,000 years old, I'm not arguing anything about the existence of God. I'm just saying that it is impossible for the earth to be only 6,000 years old and for us to have the radioactive decay rate that we have.
And I'm fine with that. It doesn't affect anything I believe, nor is it an area I've put any serious study into, just because it.
Well, and Kelly, ICR, the Institute for Creation Research here in Dallas, did a long study, and they said, look, there's too much daughter element. There is a lot of radioactive decay indicating millions of years. So they said, oh, we'll come up with something. They always come up with something. Accelerated radioactive decay.
Yeah, right.
Which, to your
Which
point,
vaporizes the earth.
boils the
right.
oceans and burns up the crust of the earth. And it's the heat problem, as you articulated, is a huge problem. And it does have theological consequences.
So, if you don't mind, Kelly, because I'd like to move on to another argument with whatever time we have left. What are your thoughts or your beliefs on whether or not there are immaterial things that exist?
Well, obviously, immaterial things exist in the sense that, there is such a thing as beauty. Beauty is not a material thing. But it's not a thing either. So I guess I would have to ask you, how are you defining immaterial thing?
Something that is not physical, but that kind of almost sounds doesn't seem to add much. So I would say things that cannot be described using the language of the hard sciences.
Yes, such things exist. For example, democracy exists, and it is not.
Well,
a physical thing.
I wouldn't say democracy exists, but I get what you're saying. So let me just, for the sake of time, let me jump to this. Do you think consciousness is physical?
No.
You think consciousness is immaterial?
Yeah, I think it exists within our brains.
So you're a property dualist.
I have no idea.
Okay.
It's not something I've studied, so I'm not familiar with the term.
Okay. So you're familiar with naturalism, the term?
Yes.
Would you consider yourself a naturalist?
I'm really not sure on that one either, because I have done a little bit of looking into that, but not enough to say for certain what my position is on, because I know a hard naturalist only believes that only natural things exist. And I don't go that far. So does that exclude me from being a naturalist? I don't know. I could not answer that question.
Fair enough. But it isn't. So I'm curious about consciousness. I'd like to go there if you're okay with that. I
Sure.
would say this is another one of the evidences for God's existence. Is now why do you say consciousness is immaterial? I'm curious.
Well, because we can't go into the brain and find the portion that is consciousness. We can't remove a part of the brain and say, okay, we have removed your consciousness.
Well, I mean, I think you could like remove certain parts of the brain and remove things like memory. You would agree with that?
Yes. And I think memory is a component of consciousness, but it's not all of it.
Okay, and so I think so. What's interesting is, so I think the best logically consistent case for atheism would have to be a hard naturalism. Otherwise, you get what's called you bloat the ontology, is what they call it. Once you start having these things that exist that you don't expect to exist, then you have to have an explanation or a reason for why they would arise. Can they be predicted? Should we expect them? And if the answer is always like no, we shouldn't, or you begin to kind of smuggle in, if you will, things into a worldview that does not seem to fit or be natural to that worldview, which at some point gives it so much baggage that it almost becomes ad hoc. And if you have a different view or position that explains these things better without being ad hoc, then it gives reason to believe one over the other. I think consciousness being immaterial is definitely one of those reasons, because there would be no reason for consciousness to pop up in a world of just physical stuff rearranging by physical stuff.
I don't have the background in science to explain that, but I do know that humans are not the only creatures that have consciousness.
Amen.
We certainly there's certainly plenty of consciousness and sentience within the animal world, and there's even some possibility of consciousness in slime. There was an experiment where slime was able to run a maze, and that was absolutely fascinating. And how did that come about? I would have to say evolution. Obviously, a creature that has consciousness is able to develop better, and so I do see that as an evolutionary byproduct. Well, byproduct is a bad word, but I do see that as being something that we have developed by evolution.
Well, but so that would be slapping a label on consciousness. But you may be familiar with what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Like, why is there consciousness to begin with, and how would it arise? Because to me, it seems to be another one of those shoehorned in beliefs within a worldview. Because it's undeniable that we're conscious, right? Even though there are some atheist philosophers who deny consciousness exists. But I think it also shows that the links they have to go to bite the bullet to be consistent with what they believe within their worldview. So yeah, I don't see how you get something immaterial squirting into existence by just rearranging physical particles. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's obvious that it can. I mean, we came up with democracy. Democracy is immaterial, and we didn't take any kind of material thing in order to create democracy. It came up through immaterial thoughts. Music comes about when people have an idea of how sounds can be put together to create. Music is not a physical thing, and yet we can create it with physical things, and we end up with an immaterial result. So yes.
So I would disagree, but I think it's fascinating you say that, and I wouldn't say democracy is like a thing out there that we've created. But okay, given that,
Well, it certainly didn't pop into existence out of nowhere, did it? And you don't think God handed democracy to us, do you?
So when I'm talking about,
It came out of human minds.
I'm talking about things like what we would call in philosophy like universals or abstract objects in particular. And whether or not democracy be an abstract object, I'm not sure, because it seems more to be a concept than a thing that exists. And without going into semantics, let me just
I'm not sure that consciousness is a thing that exists. I mean, it exists just like democracy exists, but I don't think it's necessarily a thing.
Do you think consciousness is possessed by something?
It depends on what you mean by possessed. I mean, I believe that
grounded.
Huh?
Owned and grounded?
In one sense, yes, because we each have our own consciousness and we each own our own consciousness. But nobody owns consciousness. We all have it.
Well, there is not a consciousness, right? There are
Correct.
consciousness, there are minds, right? And minds are always grounded in subjects. And again, for the sake of time, then given that we agree, and unless I'm mistaken, that we would say consciousness is immaterial.
Yes.
Okay. So now the question is what grounds it? And then here's where I would just now go
I
to
don't
this
think
whole.
it matters.
I think it matters very much. I think consciousness is what we call kind-defining properties. So you have states and properties of consciousness, and depending on what kind of things they are, will have to tell us and will inform us of what kind of thing grounds it. So it's very important. Do you believe in something like a soul?
No.
Okay. So I would argue that for consciousness to exist, you have to have a soul that's grounded. And
No.
so
Well,
if
then I don't
something.
have a soul, so I don't have consciousness.
No, I just think you're wrong in whether or not consciousness needs to be grounded. I think you have a soul. I just think you're incorrect in what you believe, right? So just because, like you said earlier, even if we didn't believe this, didn't mean it wouldn't make it not true. So then here's where it comes into the problem that talking about consciousness is. If consciousness is immaterial and you have these states and properties, then again, you need something to ground it. So essentially, I am conscious, but now the question is, what
Why
kind
do
of
you
thing
need
am I?
something to ground it? I mean, music
Because
doesn't need something to ground it, but it still exists.
which is a different nature than consciousness. But let me answer the question by saying this: thoughts and beliefs don't float around in the world by themselves, right?
So you're saying that they have to originate from somewhere. That's what you mean by grounded? Is that they just
It's
have to
not what I mean,
originate?
but that would be implied by it. When I say grounded, in other words, I don't possess your thoughts; you possess your thoughts, right? Thoughts
Correct.
and beliefs don't pop into existence out of nothing. They are grounded by something. They are possessed by a thing. So when we talk about properties, the property of redness doesn't float in the world. So when I get on the freeway, I don't try to avoid the property of redness. I try to avoid objects that possess the property of something being red. So similarly, consciousness is going to always be grounded and possessed by a conscious subject, by some subject. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. So then the question is, given that I'm conscious and you're conscious, what kind of thing are we? Are we purely physical substances, or are we immaterial substances, namely a soul? And I'm guessing, or what would you say? I don't want to put
No.
words into your mouth.
Yeah, you are. Because no, I am not purely a physical thing, because obviously there are things about me that are not purely physical. I do have thoughts, and those thoughts are not physical. I am capable of creating things that are immaterial, but I don't that none of that has anything to do with a soul.
Well,
I
I think it
actually want
does.
to I actually would like to I know this is really what you wanted to talk about, but I want to turn to one more topic, and we only have 10 minutes left. Um, since you mentioned that you buy into young Earth, do you also believe that there was a
I'm
global
not a young
flood?
Earth. I'm not a young Earth
Oh,
creationist.
you said you believe that the Earth is only 6,000 years old.
No, I said I didn't care and that I was agnostic. That the
Oh,
question
okay.
of the Earth is irrelevant to me.
All right. Do you believe there was a global flood?
Agnostic on that as well.
Okay.
Hey, Eric, I've had a question. I've been watching Soteriology 101. I've become a big fan. I love Kelly's analysis of it. But here's the thing I think they agree on. They both do not like supralapsarianism nor infralapsarianism, where in supra you have God reprobating people before the fall. In infralapsarianism, you have the fall happens and God goes, oh, well, I'll just reprobate some people here. And I thought she made a really good insight when she said, wait a minute, Leighton, you have a problem when you have libertarian free will, because after the God would know before the fall, even if there's free will and he's not making any decisions beforehand, isn't he responsible for the humans' mistakes and decisions? Does that composite what you're saying, Kelly?
Not quite. First of all, I think libertarian free will is incompatible with an omniscient, omnipotent God. Because if an omnipotent, omniscient God cannot create a being that has free will, the omniscient God would know everything that creature would do before he ever made it. And once he makes that creature cannot do anything that is outside of the omniscient being's knowledge. And therefore, the creature can't choose to do other than what the omniscient creator knew it would do before it even created it. And thus, the act of creation precludes the being from having any kind of free will.
Does that make sense, Eric?
If by that you mean I get what she's saying, I disagree. That's a whole other argument that also I think has to do with the soul, because I think if you have free will, you would need something like a soul, and I think the existence of free will is an argument for the existence of God as well. Okay, if you don't mind, Kelly, could you define what you mean by libertarian free will?
The ability to choose your own actions independent of outside influences.
Okay, I would disagree with the last part, but would you agree that how I define libertarian free will, you're the first mover of your will or actions?
Okay.
All right. So now, next question: do you think knowledge is causal?
Causal as in having been caused?
As in, so today's Saturday. You and I both know tomorrow's Sunday, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Does that cause Sunday to come into existence? Or is that what causes Sunday to be the next day?
No.
So then if...
I'm not creating Sunday either.
Right.
But if I was creating...
But we're not asking about... But we're talking about knowledge, because your argument essentially is, because God knows, therefore no free will. So
no, that is not the argument. That is not the argument.
Okay,
the argument is because God knows and he creates with that knowledge, therefore there cannot be free will. And so if I created Sunday,
no,
and
I get that.
created it knowing it would come after Saturday, then my creating it is the causal act of making it come after Saturday, not my knowledge.
Okay, but the argument... But yes, the argument is the way I admitted it was a simplified version of what you say. But how does creating it change the fact that knowledge would have to be causal on what you're arguing? Because
it isn't the knowledge that's causal; it's the act of creation that is causal.
Can God, if you can humor me for a second, if you will, within assuming Christianity is true, could God create and know what a free creature would do?
Okay, if there is a God, could it create a creature that it knows what it would do?
A free creature, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then
no, wait. You just snuck in an extra word, not a free creature.
No, I said that. I said it from the beginning, but that's fair enough.
Okay, I missed the word free then. No, he could not create a creature that was free to do something other than what he knows it's going to do.
Why?
Because that's a logical impossibility.
Well, not a logical impossibility. If, again, libertarian free will, if we agreed, we seem to, being the first mover of your will or actions, how does God knowing what I would freely do make me not the first mover of my will or actions?
And again, it's not the knowledge, it's the creation.
So how does God creating me knowing what I would do cease me to be the first mover of my will or actions?
Because his act of creation is what moved you to be doing the thing that he knew you would do.
If that's the case, we're no longer talking about...
you chose,
but
he's the one that chose to make you the way knowing that you're going to do this.
But if we're talking about him causing it, then we're no longer talking about libertarian free will, even on your definition.
Exactly. There can be no libertarian free will, which was entirely my argument. There can be no libertarian.
But you're smuggling libertarian free will in there. I mean, you're smuggling determinism in there by assuming there can't be. But your argument seems to be that because knows and created something, therefore no libertarian free will. But that assumes that both the knowledge of it and him creating us causes our actions. And I don't see how the argument... I don't see the argument there. I don't think there is an argument there.
I'm not sure where you're failing to see the argument. I'm sorry.
Where's the causal link? If I raise my hand,
the creation.
But that's being the first cause of my existence, not my will. Now you're conflating categories.
Okay. Now I see what you're saying. Okay. It's that You might feel like you have caused your hand to raise, but just because you feel like you were the one that caused your hand to raise, because God created you knowing you are going to raise your hand, his act of creation is what caused you to raise your hand, even though you might feel like it was your own personal decision.
But no, all you did was reiterate your assertion, which is still, I don't see the argument. How does the only thing you added to what I observed, the only thing you added was I felt like I moved it. But I still don't see how that answers the question of whether or not I was the first mover. He's a first mover. He's a first cause of my existence, not the first cause of my will. Those are two different categories, and you seem to be conflating the two.
No, I'm not conflating the two. You're assuming that you have a will, and I'm saying you can't possibly have a will to begin with.
I'm saying I'm the first mover of my will, if libertarian free will is true.
So I realize that's God, what you're saying.
But yes, in other words, because I think you think you have a will too. You just probably don't believe it's a free will, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so we both believe we have wills. The question is, are we the first mover of our wills? I say yes, and we agree on the definition of libertarian freedom. What you have added was, well, God created me and he knew what I would do. How does that affect my will?
It affects your ability to what you can choose. You can only choose to do that which is within what God knew you would do before he created you.
So now I think we're conflating a different set of categories, because it's essentially a question that is really a two-part question. One, can I do something? God knows I'm going to raise my hand. The question is, can I refrain from raising my hand? My answer is yes, I have the ability to refrain from raising my hand. A separate question
But that breaks God's omniscience.
No, because the second embedded question that I think are two tied together is there anything I can do that God does that wouldn't know? I say the answer is no. So the only way to make this argument work is to assume that knowledge is causal. And if knowledge is not causal, then the argument collapses. There is no argument.
No, that's not the case. That's not the case. Because, okay, at the time that God creates you, he knows you're going to raise your hand. You do not exist, but yet he knows that that's going to happen if he creates you. If he chooses not to create you, then you won't raise your hand. That's why it's the act of creation that is causal, not the knowledge.
That would only guarantee that in the world that he chooses to create, because he also knows counterfactuals, that I would raise my hand in this scenario, but not in this one. So that alone would show that the knowledge of it doesn't cause it. Now, you add in the caveat of it being created. I still don't hear an argument of the connection that because he created and knew, that causes me. What is the logical contradiction of saying God has created free creatures and knows what they would do freely? Where's the contradiction?
The contradiction is that if God knows what you are going to do before you do it, and he knows not only before you do it, but before you even existed, that this is what you will do.
Well, I disagree there, because before anything existed, he had the option to create a variety of different types of worlds.
Exactly.
So the knowledge right there doesn't do anything. It doesn't carry any weight.
Exactly. It's the act of creation that carries the weight.
But even then, the act of creation, once he creates me, and if he gives me free will, what you're saying, that can't be because he created it.
I'm saying he can't do that. It's right. Logically impossible for him to give you free will.
But okay, as a side note, because I know we're running out of time here, the irony, here's why I say free will is an argument in favor of God's existence. Here's one small point in it, is the irony in arguing there is no free will is that you have to assume I have the freedom to change my mind. So to even argue there is no free will is itself self-defeating. So I would say that's one reason to believe.
No, because I'm not going to make the argument that you have the freedom to change your mind.
You assume I do.
If there were no God, you would have the freedom to change your mind. If there was a God that was not omniscient, you would have, or a God that was the creator, you would have those options.
I would say if there's no God, we wouldn't even be conscious. I don't think.
I realize that's your
and much less there wouldn't be no free will, because the most consistent is without going into that, because that goes into soul. But there's still him creating me. How does creation? What again? I still haven't heard the argument of what is the logical inconsistency of creating free creatures.
Because God has the option of create. Okay, if God is omniscient and omnipotent, and the creator, he can create you to be any way he wants you to be. And he can create
I
you.
don't think so.
You don't think so?
Mm-mm.
So God's not omnipotent. He can't
It's not the
choose to
definition
create
of
you any way
omnipotent.
he wants you to be?
How do you define omnipotence?
All powerful. He can make you any way, he can do whatever he wants to with
God
as
can-
long as it's not logically contradictory.
Right. So if you're saying create me any way I want to, if you're talking about me, Eric Hernandez,
Right.
then him creating me without free will, or say creating me in something that impedes on my nature, then it's no longer me.
Right. But he had the option
And
to create you or create or not create you or create a different version of you or
well,
whatever he so chooses.
without going to all the details, here's my point: is that if he gave me free will, and I know we're disagreeing here, but if he gave me free will, then it is not up to him what I do.
Okay, but I don't think that's logically possible for him to do.
And you still have to show the logical contradictions to say A and not A is both true. Where is the A and not A in that?
All right. I'll have to come up with that and send that to you or have you back on another time
Okay.
because we are out of time. We are out of time.
Well, I have enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
Okay. So if you want a copy of Eric's book, there is a link in the description. If you'd like to see more of Bill Kluck, go to the Atheist and Christian Book Club, and they are every Thursday.
Yeah, first Thursday in June, we're going to have Eric back on and maybe answer some of these questions. I've enjoyed listening to you guys on the free will thing, so hopefully we can get an answer on next month.
Okay, very good. And obviously, I'm Godless Granny, and thank you all for listening. I know that I've kind of ignored the chat more than I normally do. Normally, I take a lot more of the comments, but it was too difficult today to read all of the comments as we were going along. So my apologies to the audience that I have not been more interactive with you. And thank you, Eric, and thank you, Bill. It has been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you.
Live your life.